All right, good morning. So today we are going to be looking at serverless Twitter, and got my coffee here. It is I don't know what the blend is, but it's Arabica beans, I think. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. Anyways, so yeah, what I wanted to do is just do like a early morning live stream here, looking through different things. So maybe today it's serverless Twitter, maybe tomorrow it's an article, maybe it's a topic. Not sure. I'm hoping to just keep it relatively short. So we're starting here around like 8:15. So maybe we'll close up around like 8:30 or something like that. But yeah, so I'm just gonna scroll through and I guess drink coffee, and then we can talk about any of the top serverless things going on. So already what we can see here is Matt Lewis. Looks like he's going to be speaking for the first time at Serverless London meetup, which is awesome. It looks like it's this event here, so you can go to that link on meetup and attend it. So I'm not sure what it's covering. Maybe let's take a look. Okay, so it's a remote meetup, which I guess we can assume that. Serverless Days YouTube channel, which is cool. Going to have Yan, CEO of Coeb, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. Firecracker Micro VMs, that sounds cool. Firecracker Micro VMs sounds like what AWS came out with a while back. Firecracker, which is what AWS Lambda runs on top of. So maybe this company started based on that technology that AWS developed. I'm not sure, but it seems like lightweight virtualization of containers and serverless workloads. So maybe that is the case, which is awesome. Then you have Matt Lewis, who's an AWS data hero. That's cool. Building trust at the data layer with serverless. And sponsored by Theodo. So shout out to Theodo and Ben LRB on that one. I'm sure he's part of that event. All right, let's keep going. This was actually the one that we did yesterday for Serverless Guru. So we had Vishnu Prasad from our team who gave a presentation on scaling serverless. And so you can take a look at this image real quick. So in this talk, Vishnu talked about serverless artillery, which is a load testing tool that you can use to hit your serverless workload. So like you give it an API gateway endpoint or your GraphQL endpoint, and let's say behind that's a Lambda function, which was the case here. And so what'll happen is you just start sending requests to it, and these are artificial requests, and all you're trying to see is where do things break down. And what it ended up exposing when we started this challenge, Vishnu and I had a conversation, which was, can we get AWS Lambda to run like 30,000 concurrent requests, right? Or can we do something like that, like 30,000 requests per second, or some crazy thing like that? And the default for AWS Lambda concurrency, I believe, is typically 1,000. So you can have 1,000 concurrent requests happening at the same time that are having those invocations run, and that's across your entire account and that specific region specifically. So you can increase those limits, but going from 1,000 to 30,000 is kind of a jump. So at least in increasing it. So is there a way that we could architect it different? Is there a way that we could set that up? And that allowed us to go through this really iterative process of understanding truly how Lambda scales. And Vishnu did a really amazing job at doing this. So he presented this yesterday. So the same way that you're seeing this live stream right now on this YouTube channel, if you subscribe, you'll also be able to see the recording that we edited. We did the meetup yesterday. We had our marketing lead at Serverless Guru get the video edited, and we're ready to post it. We're waiting for this morning or around like mid-afternoon today. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel and you're interested in like deep diving into like how AWS Lambda scales, then that would be a good place to go. All right, continuing down the path, looks like we have Jeremy Daly here from the Serverless Chats podcast, talking about how new Relic lets you zoom. Let me pause this. It's too much input. It's too early in the morning. 1 second. Okay. All right. So how New Relic lets you zoom in with Nica fee, see how to get insights into individual transactions, troubleshoot the systems involved, and use distributed tracing to show connected services. So that's really awesome. I know New Relic's dipped their toe into it. There was, I believe, it was IO Pipe was acquired by New Relic, and IO Pipe, I want to say, was also based out of Portland, Oregon, or at least in the northwest of the United States. And then they got acquired by New Relic, who's based in Portland, Oregon. They had this gigantic, like pink bronze building in downtown Portland, Oregon. And I've given talks at the New Relic office before. It's super nice, and it has like an overlook of the mountains. But yeah, so newrelic.com. So that's cool. So if you're interested in Serverless Chats podcast, Jeremy Daly has kind of been the inspiration for a lot of stuff that I do. So definitely check out his content. All right, scrolling on down, we got Dashbird. Funny enough, we did a collaboration with the Dashbird folks just maybe like a week or 2 weeks ago. We did a joint webinar. God, that might have been a month and a half or 2 months ago actually. Time is really flying at the moment. But let's see. Dashbird talks about AWS Lambda triggers explained. AWS Lambda triggers are actions caused by specific AWS resources. These actions generate events that will further execute Lambda functions that listen to them. And here's exactly how it works. So you know what? Let's open it up and let's see. Okay, we got Taavi. So this is, I've had Taavi on the podcast before. We have a podcast called Talking Serverless podcast. And on that podcast, we talk serverless. And you can find that at Talking Serverless IO. And Taavi was on, and then we did a joint webinar between Serverless Guru and Dashbird recently, which went really well. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through here and see if anything really jumps out of it. I'm sure it's a really good read, but I won't bore you with the line by line. Okay, so here you go. Got me with the a bad decision question mark. A little catchy title there. So Lambda triggering another Lambda. Is it a bad decision? So that is a common architecture, right? When you have, because it's very easy to do a Lambda invoke inside of, the AWS SDK is there. You can just write it in Node.js, and it seems like the easiest way to, get it done sometimes. But is it the best approach? So let's find out. Is it the best approach? Well, according to Dashbird, it is a bad practice. And why is it a bad practice? Because if you don't finish your Lambda before you start the next one, you're paying for both running. And it also is like this weird thing where, like, when you invoke the other Lambda, like they're saying, the first Lambda is idling, so you're paying for that. But also it can get really tricky because in some of these situations, you go, okay, I want to reshare code inside of my serverless architecture. And to do that, I want to be able to Lambda invoke another Lambda, right? And I can have a separate Lambda. This is going to be my shared library code. And then I'll just invoke from other things. And it's a very slippery slope. And it's a slippery slope because the second you start doing that, you'll then almost want to keep repeating that process. And you can easily get into a situation where other teams, depending on this, when we're talking about real software, not like real software, but like we're talking about like big teams, it gets really tricky. Maybe a smaller team, it's better, more manageable, because it's just one team and the communication is really close. Feedback loops the loop is very close on communication. When talking bigger teams, the Lambda invoke to another Lambda function, and that's shared library code. Different teams could create their own shared library Lambda code, right? And then who's maintaining the deployment process on that? That's like one element to it. But also, when we get into a situation where Team A creates this Lambda to handle processing part 1, and then Team B creates processing Lambda part 2 that has shared code and they're separate, now you have this one function that's invoking other functions, and it gets into this really messy state really easily because you can end up having somebody new join the team and they can create separate Lambdas for each one of their things, and they're calling it from all this other stuff. And now you just have this web of one Lambda calling 4, 5, 6 other Lambdas. And we've seen this happen on the consulting side previously. And so let's look at what the solution to this is. You should always put another service between your Lambda functions and don't call them directly. So this has been, I guess, like to some degree, this has been advice that's been thrown around since I started, which was back in 2017. Yeah, like 2017 with serverless. Maybe like late 2017. was basically put SQS in front of it. So it's just like Lambda to SQS to Lambda, for instance. However, at that time, there wasn't a SQS Lambda event trigger. And so you then had to create a separate Lambda on a cron job that would then pull SQS messages. And so I built an entire, I built an architecture like that while I was at Nike trying to solve this exact problem. And yeah, it's much easier now than it was previously. Okay, so this is going through like how to invoke stuff. So just kind of scroll through Lambda event sources. So you can scroll through that and check it out. It looks like there's a demo here of Dashbird. So definitely check out Dashbird. Taavi's awesome. I think he has a Dalmatian, which random fun fact there. Okay, how to debug Lambda functions with Visual Studio Code. Cool, let's check it out. Okay, so Visual Studio Code and Serverless Stack. Yes, I know recently Serverless Stack started creating their own CLI and deployment process. Serverless Stack is awesome because they created all this really deep documentation for how to use serverless. So that's actually the place that I would start if I was going to recommend somebody. How do you start with serverless? Where do you get started? I think Serverless Stack has everything that you need to get going. Of course, we have a training course as well at Serverless Guru called it's at training.serverlessguru.com, and it's a 0 to paid professional course. I would say Serverless Stack will have a comparable effect. Obviously, the training course that we made is videos, and so maybe we can show a little bit more visually than just text and images. But every person that comes through Serverless Guru or somebody that asks, I usually recommend Serverless Stack first as the go-to here. But this is talking about how to debug Lambda functions with Visual Studio Code, and so you can create a Serverless Stack app. And you can see here they're installing Serverless Stack latest. They're creating a new folder here called VS Code, or seeding into it. I guess this command here with npx was using the Serverless Stack CLI and then creating a new folder potentially, or a new project called VS Code. They CD into it. It looks like by default Serverless Stack gives you a lib folder for your app infrastructure and a source folder for your app code. And then it says here to set up your API. So it looks like they have a TypeScript file here underneath the lib folder called mystack, and you can see that here. So they're importing the Serverless Stack library and the resources module inside of it. They have, okay, so they're using like class-based, I guess that's TypeScript, but I have a constructor here, and gosh, it's been so long since I worked with like Java or like TypeScript in a in a real way. I built an Android app a long time ago, and but that was a very simple. It was a very simple app. It's called Wise Commute. You can actually find it on the Android store. So if you're in the Portland, Oregon area and you want an app that sort of works, sort of doesn't. I mean it works, but if the train already arrived, it then says that it's going to arrive in like 12 hours. So there's like weird bugs like that, but you can find on the Android store is like Wise Commute Portland trains, and it has like a cool like green, blue, red display. I made it right after I got out of, or I made it during code school when I was going through code school in like early 2017. And yeah, anyways, okay. So create an HTTP API here. So really simple syntax. It looks like the Serverless Stack people have their own abstraction APIs. So you can see here, it looks like it's an abstraction over the CDK. So if you're unfamiliar with the CDK is, so there's different ways that you can build infrastructure on AWS. And you have the programmatic way, which is through the AWS CDK. I think it's called AWS Amazon Web Services Cloud Development Kit. And it basically allows you to write TypeScript or JavaScript or other languages, Golang, Python, I believe all support it. And you can build your Lambda functions and your API endpoints and all that stuff through programmatic approach. And so what it looks like Serverless Stack did is they created a wrapper over the CDK. And so what this actually does in practice, or in reality, when you call new serverless stack.api, and then you're passing it these arguments, in the background, this Serverless Stack API function that's going to create the API is then using the syntax for the AWS CDK. And what that allowed for people to do is like Serverless Stack to create their own frameworks, their own programmatic frameworks over the top. And I mean, my experience with CDK versus like, let's say AWS CloudFormation or AWS CloudFormation or AWS SAM or serverless framework or CDK, I think it comes down to probably what your team is comfortable using. I still like the guardrails of CloudFormation, so when I go for an abstraction, I'm still opting for the, I think there's a quote from somebody, maybe Albert Einstein, that says like, you can take it simple to a degree, but you can't go any simpler or something like that, or it starts to get complex, whatever that is. But like the point is still the same. It's like you have guardrails around CloudFormation. This is my view. And then serverless framework allows you to rely on those guardrails, so you don't have to recreate all the process of how the creation of resources takes place. Because for instance, right here, serverless stack.api, obviously they have they've created their own functions that wrap over the CDK, and so maybe serverless stack is abstracting some of the process of creating CDK resources. But I haven't worked on it too much, so I can't really speak definitively on it. But I could see, and I've heard this be thrown around before, that that you're almost having to also create the debug process and debug and troubleshoot certain aspects of how the creation pipeline happens of resources, right? So like if I'm using CloudFormation and I give it the wrong configuration, then CloudFormation is going to have its own catches and all the logic that AWS has already created for me. And so I just give it a file, like the YAML file. It's like a blueprint. I hand them a blueprint piece of paper, and then they process it through their machine. The machine says back, hey, you got something wrong, right? And then I go, okay, let me try to fix it, and I'll give them the blueprint again, and we'll just keep repeating that cycle until eventually I have my Lambda function created. With the CDK, the way that it seems to me is that you almost are creating that creation pipeline as well. So you're replacing CloudFormation with your own, and maybe CDK like does parts of that. So I can't speak definitively on it. But as you can see here, we're writing TypeScript at this point to create an API, and it's like these parameters create the API, but then we're also writing application code, and so then we have to debug if we miss a curly brace or something. I don't know. It's semantics. I'm talking too much on it, so let's just keep going. Okay. So anyway, so we have outputs here, API endpoint. So with CloudFormation, with resource creation, these outputs allow for cross-stack communication. So maybe you have one stack that builds your Lambda function and another stack that builds your API, and maybe you want to connect that Lambda function to your API. In most cases, you probably just want them in one stack, but we'll just use that as an example. You can output the value or the name of that Lambda function, or the ARN, which is the Amazon resource name, which is almost like a unique address of that Lambda function inside of your AWS account. And what that allows you to do is then connect that to your other stack, which would be your API stack. And now you can reuse that output inside of the API stack to then connect your API and flush it out and all that stuff. I'm assuming that Serverless Stack is doing most of that stuff for you. This simple syntax here of like git slash and then giving it a file, what they're probably doing is almost like this is probably creating, like, in CloudFormation terms, probably like 100 lines of CloudFormation or 150 lines of CloudFormation. Potentially in serverless framework, maybe it's creating like 10 lines. It's a little bit more comparable in that case. But yeah, it's doing a lot for you, it seems. And I didn't know about any of the stuff that this is my first time looking at it, so it's cool to see all the stuff they have. Okay, so it looks like you can extend the Lambda function timeouts. Index.TypeScript. Looks like there's this serverless stack app variable that gets passed around. I would assume it gets passed around all over the place. And you can change the function properties. And so here we're setting the timeout to 30, and we could also increase that by changing the timeout here differently. And you can see that when we finally create our stack, we're passing it the app, which then has our default properties, and our timeout here. And you can see they have a switch statement here for is it local, and this is important because, you know, just like anything, you want to be able to have that switch. Like maybe you want your like this is local switch, maybe it's not going to well, actually this is relevant both in like application code and locally, so I won't assume to know how they're playing it. But let's just see here. It says we're using a serverless stack built-in environment variable called isLocal to set a longer Lambda function timeout if our app is running locally. Okay, so there you go. So if you wanted to have custom serverless stack properties here, you could add them here just for the local. And then if you wanted to potentially do this based on, like maybe you could have an environment that's like development or production and then switch it based on that as well, add different properties in. The reason why I brought that up, and it might be a little bit more difficult or less difficult with serverless stack CLI, is that with the serverless framework, you can do something similar, and you can say like SLS deploy -- stage dev or prod, and then based on that that environment switch, right, from development to production, you could have special YAML, which will then say use this relational database for MySQL or for Postgres, but don't use the cluster, use like a single tiny instance, right? Or yeah, it's basically like that. Or and so in this case, same thing, same exact thing, except for the local development, they're setting the timeout to 30. In my example, it would be like if it was development, don't use the production size cluster database, or if you're going to use a cluster, use the smallest possible. Whereas production, maybe you have to hit multiple AZs and all that stuff. And you know, you can make the argument, practice how you play, right? But also we're talking about potentially a lot of money, so depending on your company's outlook on that, you know, use caution. Okay, so scrolling down further, got another Lambda TypeScript file here. Looks like this is the handler file. So this might actually be what's processing your Lambda code. So like when we think about the business logic, potentially this is the business logic part. You can see here that there's a series of events that come through. So TypeScript, I guess, is nice here. So the event type here is API Gateway Proxy event. And then it's saying to create a message, the time in Lambda is X, and then it's returning a status code of 200. So when the request comes in, it's then going to respond back. And as we can see up here, when we define the infrastructure, it's a GET request. So when somebody hits our API at the / route with a GET request, so just using the URL in a browser, for instance, it should send back a status code of 200 and then have a body that says hello world. And this is the VS Code launch configuration. I'll let y'all scroll through that if you're interested. And then you can start a dev environment from VS Code. That's cool. Okay, so it'll bootstrap your AWS environment to use CDK. Okay, so that's, I'm glad that we're on the right track with the CDK rant, because otherwise that would have been like such a long period of time. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So let's just zoom in a bit. And I'm going more in depth here because this is new to me as well. And so I'm just, you know, I'm learning at the same time anybody watching is learning. So we have variables here shown. We have a watch tab. We have the debug serverless stack. We've got a step through type of thing where we can set a breakpoint, and then we can. Okay, so that's cool. So we're doing breakpoints inside of our Lambda function here, and it appears serverless stack is allowing us to get that done. And I know that other providers, like other third-party platforms, have had that as well. I can't put my finger on it. Maybe like a Lumigo or Thundra or Dashbird or somebody's had something like this similar to this. It's escaping my mind at the moment. And it's for breakpoints and specifically to help with areas like this, because a lot of other development for a long time, you weren't able to do breakpoints and do this type of local testing in a very streamlined way. And so now you can see the maturity of serverless, because all these type of problems are now being addressed, and that's how you can tell that that serverless is maturing quite a bit, because they're starting to hear people that are transitioning to building apps with serverless and serverless, you know, fully managed services on cloud providers, and also like using like serverless framework or CDK, or building on AWS for, you know, cloud native serverless architecture. and out of that they need certain things developed that didn't exist previously. And for a long time, when people would evaluate is serverless the right fit right now, they would say no, because our development process would normally use breakpoints. We would normally use this debug process. We can't do that. None of the products support that. And so now today, you can even see that serverless stack is supporting things like that. So that's good. All right, so making changes without having to redeploy. So you can take advantage of using a live Lambda development environment. That's cool. This is something that started happening recently with, maybe like a year ago with, I believe it was serverless components from the Serverless Inc. team and serverless.com. And they started doing this where you could basically have like refresh of your Lambda code without having to redeploy the infrastructure that's running underneath. And I believe that was also because of the CDK, potentially. Maybe it was. Yeah, I want to say that that was the case where CloudFormation's limitations around that, it made the development process a bit tougher, because the wait times for CloudFormation to process that blueprint, for instance. So it's like the guardrails are great until they aren't, and then you just have to make sure that you don't go so far off the guardrails that you have to recreate everything from scratch. And so potentially, if you're watching this video in 6 months or a year or 3 years or 5 years from now, maybe all these problems have been solved, where the because there's an approach, right? Like even when we were looking at how does the serverless stack CLI run, I had to type npx serverless stack latest, and maybe there's a SST CLI, there probably is, but let's just imagine that was the case where it was just the npx. Well, that's a pretty big barrier to entry, and I'm not ranting on serverless stack so much as just ranting on the progression of technology and how things mature. And so right now, that's the case. But in a year from now or 2 years from now, there'll be the abstractions there where it's much easier to build on top of. And once people can build on top of CDK in a way that rivals or far exceeds CloudFormation and those guardrails, and all that stuff is much more approachable than CloudFormation. And CloudFormation is not that approachable. So even CloudFormation needs, the user experience of that takes a while to scale up. The assumption is that at some point that process of developing with it will just become easier and easier. And you could say that has happened for CloudFormation purely from the standpoint of documentation, tutorial videos, articles from the community. And so the more things that we have like that around CDK and around abstractions on top of CDK, like serverless stack, then maybe we'll get to that point where, that argument around, that I was using earlier is less relevant. Okay, so we've got that here. We deploy the API by doing npx SST deploy. So very similar to serverless deploy if you're already familiar with Serverless Inc. and Serverless Framework. And same thing with the remove commands, and then that's it. Yeah. So I love the serverless stack people, because you can see this. It's like how to create REST API with serverless, how to do it with TypeScript, Golang, how to do GraphQL API with Apollo, how to build databases. So authentication, JWT, async tasks. So when people ask and they say like, man, I just can't figure out serverless, it's like, go to serverless stack, look at their maybe their guide. Well, I know that serverless stack is starting to build their own product now. So yeah, you can see that here. So maybe the usage, CDK, packages. So maybe the developer stuff is somewhere else now. I'm not really sure. So yeah, that's a bit, I wish it was more on the front page here, because I know serverless stack used to just be the documentation side for developers. So I'm not sure what they did with that. So anyways, let's get back to serverless Twitter. All right, so thank you for this one. Vadim. Oh my gosh, I am so awful with names. Okay. Listening here, our CFO critique highlights our financial performance in financial year 2021. Cool. cross-posted to Dev2, creating Azure Functions University, and open source educational product. Very cool. From Mark here. Like this one already. Let's go ahead and jump into it. Cool. We're also on YouTube. That's awesome. Azure Functions University, educational project to learn about Azure Functions, the functions as a service offering in Microsoft Azure. Very cool. Enable newcomers to serverless technology. Fantastic. So you can get the lessons on GitHub and the videos on YouTube. Started in October 2020. Consider myself reasonably experienced with Azure Functions. A lot more contributions coming in, which is cool. So that means that it's growing. So we have HTTP, we have blah, we have queues, tables, deployment, configuration, Cosmos DB, durable functions. And look at that. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff here. We've got 9 videos so far. Last update was April 18th. And we've got HTTP lessons for .NET, Q lessons, table lessons. This is super cool. Yeah, I know we, like at Serverless Guru, we're starting to get involved on Azure stuff as well. We have clients that, just spilled coffee on my hand. We have clients that we work with that use AWS mostly, so we're like 95% AWS. And then we have some workloads happening on Google Cloud, some workloads happening on Azure. But the requests that we get sometimes are to help clients that we're already working with on AWS migrate other .NET things, and sometimes that involves an Azure element to it, or at least it involves a .NET Azure versus Lambda comparison thing to happen. And so Azure has been popping up more and more, so this is very cool. Cool. So if you want to help out here, let's see, there's a contribution page. There's the YouTube playlist, Azure Functions University GitHub repo, and so on. So super cool, Mark. Thanks for sharing. Let's keep scrolling on through. I don't think anybody knows that I'm doing this, which is hilarious. So yeah, it's hilarious because I'm liking the post, but I don't know if anybody actually knows that there's a there's a video of me actually going through their stuff. Okay, Antstack.io. Yeah, Antstack is cool. They're a consulting company that does something similar to Serverless Guru in the serverless space, and they're starting to build up more and more content and all that stuff. So you can see something here. Clear data expands, flagship. Okay, so maybe this is a shared article that they're doing for Business Insider. That's cool. Here we go, serverless chats again. So we've got episode 98, Making Serverless Accessible with Bit Project with Daniel Kim, is now available. Watch on YouTube. Cool. So if you want to see how serverless accessibility with the Bit Project, definitely check that one out. We got David here saying, going to release a new open source tool next week that helps people document and discover event bridge schemas. Oh, that's awesome. Hopefully it will be zero code, just some config, and that's it. The homepage is overkill, but I'm having fun with it. Cool. Well, let's see what we've got. Zoom in here. Event Bridge Atlas. Document, discover, and share your AWS Event Bridge schemas. Set up within minutes. I'm trying to zoom in more, but I can't. This looks like you have this side navigation here, potentially of all your schemas, and then you can actually see them. So I'm imagining this is similar to maybe like a Swagger UI, but for Event Bridge schemas, which I think is something that has been missing with Event Bridge. So this is so cool. And it's awesome to see people in the community do things like this, where they see a gap and they have the technical know-how and then they build it. And that's just amazing. All right, building modern serverless APIs with AWS DynamoDB, Lambda, API Gateway Part 4. Okay, well, that's awesome. So that's Part 4. So there's 3 other parts. So if you're looking to learn how to build modern serverless APIs with AWS, you've got DynamoDB, Lambda, API Gateway here, and it looks like it's a whole series and it's building with SAM. So we've talked about serverless stack, we've talked about serverless framework, CloudFormation, CDK. We've pretty much gone through the gambit of different ways to build Lambda functions and cloud resources on AWS. And this is another series here from Rosius. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong too. I need to take a class on name pronunciation because I'm just very awful at it. Okay. Part 1, we modeled and designed access patterns for our application entities. Part 2, we designed a primary key and global secondary index, sample database schemas using NoSQL Workbench. That's awesome. We started coding up our API using SAM and wrote a couple of scripts to create a user, get a user by ID. Cool. So it looks like it's the kind of the CRUD post, and now we're into updating a post, creating a comment, getting all comments. Yeah, that's awesome. So you got some Lambda code here and Python. So if you're used to seeing only Node.js and you want to learn how to build APIs with Python on using AWS SAM as well. So, I mean, there's like 2 elements here. If you want to learn Python and you want to learn AWS SAM, then check out this article series here on fatrabbitapps.com from Rosius, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong still. And here we can see the AWS SAM infrastructure code. So it looks similar to CloudFormation if you're familiar with that. If you're not, what you're doing is you're just saying like, you're telling AWS that you want to create a AWS serverless function, and that's how AWS SAM, serverless application model, SAM, the acronym there, that's how that functions. You can see properties here. The code URI is post slash, which I'm assuming is the local folder in this setup here. And this is also the template.yaml file. And then, oh, that's cool. If you hover over it, it pops up. Oh, look at that. That's pretty awesome. That's really cool. Okay, handler is update.update post. I'm assuming that underneath the post folder locally in this tutorial, there's an update.js or update.py file, and then update_post is that handler function. Let's see if that's accurate. Yeah, there we go. So update_post. Back a long time ago, I wrote Python, so I can know sort of how it works. Okay, policies. I would love to write Python again or have Serverless Guru work with Python. It's just that we don't really have clients come in that use it. But we have a lot of stuff that we do with machine learning and other things like that in the past, which is partly where my Python experience comes from. But yeah, that'd be cool. I'm looking forward to machine learning expanding background processing things that normally use Python, and what else? I know blockchain development with like Ethereum development uses JavaScript, but maybe you can use Python there too. So regardless, at some point, hoping that Python keeps catching on in the serverless community, and then we get more options or opportunities to work with Python. But this is interesting as well. You can see the maturing nature of, I just got coffee all over me now. The maturing nature of serverless is that we talked about all these different infrastructure as code providers, but we also have .NET, Node.js, and now we have Python as well. So you can see there's a lot of different things that people are using to work with serverless, and even different cloud providers. So we've had Azure, and now we have AWS here. So this is an API. We've got a pass of /post/ID with a method of put. And so this code here is going to create a Lambda function that has an API in front of it that has this URL that takes a dynamic ID in the URL path and passes that to the Lambda function. So there's a ton of stuff happening out of this. And yes, it's not my favorite, like AWS SAM versus like Serverless Framework, for instance. However, it's very similar to Serverless Framework syntax-wise. So even if you're not familiar with SAM, you probably can read this coming from Serverless Framework, and vice versa. If you're familiar with SAM and you start picking up Serverless Framework, you can probably read the structure and so forth. So I kind of like that aspect of it. Obviously, we can only build so much maybe with the limitations, and maybe sometimes we have to recreate the entire system from scratch and use completely different verbs. But I guess when you're thinking about like hitting the widest possible audience, like the most amount of people possible, right? then you probably want to use some of the standardizations that have already been developed, and then just add things to it or make it easier, right? So like events, you have an HTTP post event, maybe you have a different event that's called, you know, super cool new way of building things. And so it keeps the similar structure here that people are familiar with, make sure all the documentation's in sync, but then you can modify this one piece so that it's easier to work with. Or you swap out properties here, you have a different type that you define for AWS SAM, and you can kill all these properties and use your own super cool code URI path, right, that does some extra optimization on top of it, but we still keep the generic format the same and the structure and the idea of this similar, so that every 2 years we're not throwing out the bathwater, I guess, the baby out with the bathwater, I guess it would be. So scrolling on down, we've got fetch user and posts, and you can see it takes an event and context. It looks like it is pulling an environment variable, table name, and setting it as table. I guess is DynamoDB the Bodo? Yeah, so Bodo 3 is like the AWS SDK, but for Python. And you can see here that we're setting, so we're saying DynamoDB.table, and they're passing it to table name, and then I think it's establishing that connection, maybe? Yeah, maybe so, I don't know. Or it's making a query. Maybe it's pulling the data back. I haven't looked at the Bodo 3 in a while to do DynamoDB stuff. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay, so it's establishing the connection to the table, or at least like the properties of it, and then you can do table.query here. Part of me assumes that you could probably do dynamodb.table and then os.environment table name and then .query, but that would get kind of lengthy. And so instead, he set it as a variable here just to make it more readable. Yep, and then sending back a 200 status code response. And yeah, and that's it. See another view here of a different function and also the API definition. So we have SAM build, use container, and then SAM deploy guided. So I'm assuming SAM deploy guided will give you the UI, the GUI that we're seeing here in the CLI. So where you can set what is the stack name, what is the region, and all the different information here. And then we can see the output being sent out from the terminal from AWS SAM with each endpoint being created there. And then it says that he's going to use Postman to test. And it looks like, okay, so he took the URL, plugged it in, hit the raw data file, or raw option, posted in the JSON, and that's our input, it looks like, is what he's saying. And then our output is this. So after he makes a request, it goes to this URL here at the top, this HTTPS. And then the background, it goes to the Python Lambda that he set up. And then it takes in this input here through the event. Then that Lambda function behind this URL then gets that event and then sends back a response with PK, SK, and data from the database, it looks like. And it looks like he shows the DynamoDB view inside the AWS console, and he shows the create post output on Postman, fetch post, and goes over conclusion. So yeah, so this is really well written. So kudos to atehrosius. Very awesome here, and like that one. Cool. Moving on down. I'm probably gonna stop in like just a moment. I think this was a good use of time. I'm having a good time just talking to myself in my apartment. All right, so check out Stackoscope, a free open source tool that runs a health check on your AWS serverless environments with a single CLI command. So this is a very popular thing that's happening now with the different third-party providers. We've got Lumigo doing it, we have Dashbird doing it. We had, gosh, one of the security companies, serverless security companies a long time ago was doing this as well. I can't remember what the name is. Oh, it's been so long. But yeah, so it's basic idea of like, take what Serverless Guru does. We go to clients, we've been working with serverless for a long time. As I'm sure you can tell in this video, you know, I've been around the block quite a bit around all these different tools and building in different languages and serverless, you know, all that stuff. And so how do you take that knowledge and then try to make it easier for people joining today to know about all the things that I just talked about, or at least some of the nuances of building serverless apps. Well, you can do that through building into these existing third-party platforms like Lumigo guardrails that will pop up automatically when maybe as a developer I'm writing something in the wrong way, or maybe it's not the wrong way, but it could be optimized. I was always interested about this back when I started, because once I realized that these third-party observability tools like Lumigo had all that data about the application, then the natural thing is that it made sense that if they have all the data, they could then use it to then give that feedback back to the user. I thought about building something around this a while back, but I have a lot of ideas, and I guess just not a lot of execution on those ideas. So it's cool to see this like fully come to form, and I'm sure it's going to keep developing. So there'll probably be, I would imagine there would be this around the serverless infrastructure. That'd probably be one of the easiest things to tackle first. So like if you're using, let's say, read and write capacity, and then Lumigo has all the data for your DynamoDB table, and they know that you set 10 read, 10 write capacity, but then this table is never used, it could easily give you the recommendation that you should either switch to pay per request or scale a read and write capacity down to like 1, 2, 3. You know, you don't need it to be 10 or 100 if you're not getting traffic over a certain duration. You could do that with Lambda functions. You could do that with like the CloudWatch logs. You could do that with everything. And what you need to be able to make those insights happen is exactly what all these observability tools have, which is the data. So, and then the system can start improving itself, and you can have checklists, and you can have, you can say, you can immediately flag when you scan their account. All these Lambda functions have memory set at 3000, but we looked at the past 30 days or 90 days, and we can see that in reality, they're not actually used, they're idle. We flagged them as like yellow, we flagged them as red to go through. It's almost like an audit tool, right? And so I don't know if, I'm assuming that that's what Stackoscope is, and that's kind of where the different companies are going with it. This is a way for you to basically audit your infrastructure automatically and get recommendations. And right now it's probably not super advanced, but I would imagine that's one of those things that it's maturing. So 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years in the future, then all the low-hanging fruit like Lambda, DynamoDB, all those things will be solved to a large degree. And then it'll just move up the stack. And that's why it's so important to be on the forefront of what's happening, because if you're not at the forefront and you're not kind of anticipating what's going to change, then you're solving for you're solving something that is going to be replaced, in the future. So I don't know. Stay on the forefront. Think about think about what that means to you personally. All right, so I'll stop there. You can see Webney serverless framework here, and you can also see James Beswick, who's the OG of writing articles about AWS right there as well. And he's also been on the podcast, and it was great having him on as well. Well, in that way, let's go ahead and call it a wrap here. And yeah, I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your morning. If you're just now waking up, have a good start to your day. Potentially the cadence of this, I'm not really sure the cadence of it, or the frequency or the schedule or what that's going to look like. Maybe I'll do this in the morning when I have my coffee. And I think James Beswick actually did this before. I don't know if he still does it, like serverless coffee thing. I thought it was a great concept. So he's the inspiration for this, or whoever did this first. But I've just thought about, I look at his stuff and I read through it and I'm paying attention to it. I think my perspective on it is useful for those that don't have as many years of experience looking at it. And so I feel like turning, one, it's helping like lift people up in the community. Two, it's helping some of the articles are really good. We just looked at a Python article from Rosius, and I don't remember what the URL was, but we've looked at these things and it's quality stuff that people are doing, and there's no likes on it, there's no anything around it. So yeah, so if you find this useful, let me know.